Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be looking at the politics of the early modern era. And the question we're going to be taking up is, how was early modern monarchy different from medieval monarchy? So write down that question and be prepared to answer it in our discussion forum. All right. Well, in our first lecture, we looked at economics. In our second lecture, we looked at sociology-related topics. And in this one, if anything, we're looking at political science-related questions. Hopefully you can see how all these different disciplines and branches all interplay and build off of each other in the discipline of history. Now, we're going to be talking about something called the state today. And the state is really important. It has an immense influence on our lives, whether we think about it or not. And we're going to see how the state really begins. But before we do that, what we're going to do is we're going to go back in time again to the Middle Ages. And one of the things that might jump out at you, especially if you're familiar with the current map of Europe, is just how politically fragmented medieval Europe would have been. There would have been hundreds, if not thousands, of little entities, little areas that claimed to have jurisdiction. I mean, if you look at this map, it's a gigantic mess of different territories that once existed in Europe. Now, some of these are somewhat recognizable if you know geography. Like to the far left, you can see this big pink looking thing, which would grow into France, and just to the north of it is England, and to the south, sort of, is Spain. But even for places like these, which were the most sophisticated and organized of the states of the Middle Ages, there were still hundreds of little territories and counties, all essentially autonomous. Let's take France, for instance. I mean, France had hundreds of little dukedoms and counties and manors and so on and so forth. And each one of these had its own traditions, its own customs, its own cuisine, even its own language to some degree. There really were very few places in medieval France that spoke French. There were hundreds of little dialects. People, remember I said people didn't travel much, so each village kind of developed and morphed its own separate language, essentially. Now, if we were ever going to get to the state, if we're ever going to get to the point in which we were going to have the large countries or that we associate with Europe today, someone was going to have to find a way to break down all of these regionalisms and create unified countries like France or England or Germany or whatever. Today, this still exists to some degree, but all this diversity, but it's now celebrated. Like in France, for instance, if you know anything about French cuisine, there's the cuisine of Bordeaux and the cuisine of Gascony and Provence and all these places which still retain a little bit of their local character, but of course now they've been fully integrated into the French system. Well, not only would there have been many, many different little entities claiming jurisdiction, but most people wouldn't have thought of themselves as French or British or whatever. many of these places had monarchies of some sort over them. All right, so they had a king, and in theory, the king was in charge. But for your average person, the average person on the street, they would have owed their allegiance to some intermediary body, even in a place like France. For instance, you might have thought of yourself as a citizen of a particular city, like Toulouse, for instance. And if anyone asked you, well, where do you come from? You would say, oh, I come from Toulouse. You wouldn't say, oh, I'm French. Or you might be a peasant living on a manor, in which case if you asked, well, where are you from? You might give your individual little village, or say, well, I belong to such and such a noble. Or oftentimes people belong to some sort of a religious group. They were part of a monastery, some sort of a religious order, or something like that, in which case they might say that their local bishop, well, he's the man in charge. But very few people, had any sense of being French or whatever country they happened to live in. Nor did they ever have any direct contact with the government itself. For these people, the government was whatever that local person was. That was the government to them. And so monarchs they didn't tax people directly. You never got a bill from the king. The monarch would deal with your noble, or he would deal with your town government, or he would deal with your church, but he would never deal with individual people because, well, they were represented by these intermediary bodies. Okay. Now, the dominant political system was a system called feudalism. And this system predominated during the Middle Ages. If you look at this map, this is a map of medieval France. And you'll notice there's like these little teal blobs kind of in the upper right-hand corner. And they say the royal lands of Hugh Capet. It's a little bit small, but hopefully you can see them. And this is the area that the king in 987 actually controlled. In other words, the king of France only controlled those 4 little blobs on this map. The rest of France, he had deeded away to some degree. He had given away to his lords, to some of the local, to some of the nobles, the leading nobles of his realm. All right, and so you'll see the Duchy of Normandy, or the County of Anjou, or something to that effect. All right, this is what you did in feudalism. The king couldn't actually control the whole country because of limited technology, and just the conditions of the Middle Ages didn't allow the king to exercise any sort of jurisdiction over the country. And so he would subdivide it among his great lords. Now, if you look at a country, a duchy like Brittany, for instance, Brittany might have been subdivided into several other smaller entities like counties or something like that. All right, and this is called sub-infeudation. It's a fancy word, but essentially what happened is that the Duke of Brittany, well, that's it's a couple of 100 miles long. He can't actually govern the whole thing, and so he subdivides it, sub-infeudates it. And ultimately, jurisdiction goes down to the manor level. So within any one of those little territories, you would have had many manors. And here, low-level members of the feudal hierarchy would live, like knights or whatever. And this would be, he'd have his castle there, and he would have his little power base. All right. And so land that's given away by a king or a lord is called a fief. Okay, so you get a fief from the king. And so that means that there's a type of feudal hierarchy. You have the king at the top of this hierarchy, the great lords like the dukes, maybe lesser lords like counts, and maybe below them knights. And the terminology differs depending country to country, called earls in some places, princes, and the point is there is a type of a feudal hierarchy. Now, you may be wondering, why would the king give away land? What does he get out of this? Well, the noble will administer that land, but he's also responsible for providing service to the king. This is essentially what this system is all about, feudalism. Land for military service. That's feudalism. The noble will have to swear an oath to whoever the king or the lord is, and that individual will become a vassal. That's the subordinate person. That's the underneath person. Okay? And so you get a fief, but you become a vassal. It means you're responsible for providing military service to the one who gave that to you. Now, in theory, or in practice rather, oftentimes the amount of military service you had to provide was 40 days worth. And so by being a vassal to someone, whether that person was a king or a lord, you had to show up for 40 days a year and fight on behalf of that individual. The only problem is just because you swear and promised didn't mean that vassals always kept their word. Oftentimes, vassals would not show up, either because they didn't feel like it or for ulterior motives or whatever the case would be. And so you may say, well, why doesn't the king just fire them and get someone else? Well, that's pretty difficult to do. For one, they don't receive a salary, so it's not like you can just cut off their pay. And two, they've already got their land. They've already got a power base. They already have everything they already need. And it's very difficult to get a noble out of his castle once he's in it. Castles are difficult to take. They're very effective at keeping people out, even kings. And kings only have their army for 40 years, and so 40 days a year rather. And so, if you're going to try to starve them out, that's probably not enough time. And you just really can't get inside a castle. It's really hard. I mean, bows and arrows don't do much against it. Horse charges, they don't do anything against it. And so it's really hard. And kings often have no recourse if nobles just refuse to cooperate. And so this is tough if you're the king. Now, whoever the local lord is, he's essentially the government. All right. So not only is he the boss of the serfs, since they sort of work for him, he's also the judge, he's also the administrator, and he's also the tax collector. He's essentially the government. The government is in the hands of private individuals under feudalism. Now, almost everything is local. Almost everything is in the hands of the lords, but there is a little bit of a central government in feudalism. And essentially that occurs because kings will sometimes have important decisions to make. And when they do, they will call an assembly of all their nobles and other important people in the realm. And kings will call them for very specific reasons. Most often, they'll call them because they need money. Perhaps they're going to embark on a war. Wars are expensive to some degree in the Middle Ages. And so they will call their nobles together and ask for money. Remember, the king can't really tax the country itself. He can only tax his own individual lands, which are often pretty small. And so he needs to ask the nobles if they can pony up some money. And oftentimes they're resistant to this idea. And they'll make demands of the king. They say, okay, well, we'll think about giving you money, but you got to do this, this, and that. And so the king is really in a compromised position when it comes to this. Or if the king thinks that there's a law, an important law that he needs to make, he'll have to consult his nobles, and they might, pass the law, or they might say, no, we don't think it's a good law. We don't want to do it. And then the king is powerless. Certainly, if he's going to make any sort of major war, he's going to want to talk to the nobles, since they're essentially his army, and they may or may not agree to his war plans. And so you can see, hopefully, that kings in the Middle Ages weren't really all that powerful. In theory, yes, they were in charge of the country, but in practice, they couldn't really make their authority felt. Now, these assemblies, by the way, will go by different names in different countries. So in England, it's called the Parliament. In France, this is called the Estates General. In Spain, it's called the Cortes, and in Germany, it's called the Diet. Just same thing, but just different names, all very similar. Well, important winds of change were blowing, because as we enter the early modern period, things change. All right, and we've seen some of this already. There were important economic changes that were occurring, right? The market economy, the money economy was expanding. Money was coming back into circulation. And this was going to provide the king with important new sources of revenue. Not only that, but there were important social changes which we've seen. In particular, a new social class had developed and was growing during the Middle Ages and late Middle Ages. And that new social class was the bourgeoisie. And the bourgeoisie and the king will be able to make common cause over certain things. The bourgeoisie are actually a pretty good ally for the king. And there's quite a few reasons why that's the case, but a few that I'll mention here are the bourgeoisie, they like order. Business does not thrive in chaotic environments. In other words, businessmen do not want to invest in war zones, right? Businessmen like nice, stable conditions. And so feudalism, with its fragmentation and its chaos, and the nobility does not like that. And so having a strong king is actually good as far as the nobility is concerned, for the most part. Also, the bourgeoisie want a stable currency. Now, if you'll reflect back to the map at the beginning of this lecture, you see all these different entities. Oftentimes, each of these entities would have its own currency. And so at every single little border, you'd have to do an exchange for the local currency. If you've ever traveled, this can be pretty bewildering. Going to another country, because you don't really know the currency of that other country. You can get cheated easily, right? You don't know what it's worth, really. Especially if you don't speak the language, right? And, they tell you it's 1,000 whatever, and who knows, right? Is that a lot? I don't know, So the bourgeoisie want a stable currency over a big area. And really, it's kings who are able to do that. And so they're going to become allies of kings for that reason. Also, for a variety of reasons, nobles and bourgeoisie don't normally get along. And so the bourgeoisie want a powerful ally against the nobles. And so they are naturally sympathetic to monarchy for that reason as well. So economic and social changes. Another reason are military changes. The early modern period sees the widespread use of gunpowder for the first time. Now, gunpowder was invented in the Middle Ages in China and slowly made its way to Europe, where it was soon widely adopted and really became a factor in the 15 and 1600s. And gunpowder was going to make medieval warfare obsolete. Mounted knights, the terror of the medieval battlefield, were essentially powerless against muskets and against cannon. Okay? And so the new mode of fighting was going to be armed infantrymen, armed foot soldiers, and the knight was going to become obsolete. Cannons made castles obsolete. All right? Castle walls were of little use against sustained cannon fire. And so cannons were going to change the face of war in that regard. Navies were going to now allow kings to project their power over overseas and over a wider area. Now, one of the things that this military revolution was also going to bring about was it was also going to cost a lot, right? Feudal armies were actually, from the king's perspective, they didn't really cost anything. Right now, of course, yes, you had to give away your land, but essentially everybody came with their own weapons and showed up and fought. Early modern armies were going to require a lot of money to pay soldiers, to provision soldiers, give them the ammunition and the food and the tents and the clothing they were going to need, to train soldiers, the academies and the teachers who could train them. Navies are going to be expensive. And so this is going to require an astronomical amount of money by early modern standards, right? And so this was different. It was going to mean that only really big entities like kingdoms were going to be able to afford armies like this. Little counts who could previously have their own armies before, well, that wasn't going to be the case. The biggest push, perhaps, though, was the insecurity of the early modern period. And this came both internally and externally. Internally, the 15 and 1600s were an incredibly violent time because they were the time when Europeans began to fight each other over religious beliefs. These were sometimes called the wars of religion. For a variety of reasons, Catholics and Protestants began to slaughter each other wholesale in Europe. It was an incredibly violent and disconcerting time for people. Not only that, but this period of time, the 15 and 1600s, saw a lot of noble unrest. Various nobles began fighting each other and even their king in some cases, all right, with their own private armies. And so with all this violence and chaos in the minds of many people, a strong central government, a government that was going to be able to suppress all these different factions who were killing each other and fighting each other was very desirable. People just wanted the bloodshed and the chaos to stop. Also, the wars of religion also were violent internationally. Various countries who were either Protestant or Catholic fought each other. And many people recognize, well, we need a very powerful, strong state to protect us. Otherwise, we will be overwhelmed by others. And so this process was going to set off a Darwinian struggle of survival of the fittest among different states. Larger states were going to swallow up smaller states. Richer states were going to swallow up poorer states. And more organized, centralized states were going to swallow up feudal states. All right? So it's a real survival of the fittest scenario. And so a lot of the small little entities that we saw at the beginning were going to be swallowed. Okay. Well, the early modern period was going to see the rise of something called the state. And like I said at the beginning of this lecture, states are something that we all live in, but we don't often think about how much power they exercise over us. All right? Well, what is a state exactly? You may say, well, I know that. I live in a state. I live in Massachusetts. I live in Rhode Island. Well, in a political science terms, and this is what confuses Americans oftentimes, those actually aren't states. All right. In political science terms, Massachusetts is not a state. The United States is a state. England is a state. Canada, all of the nations of the United Nations, right? Those are states. To be represented in the United Nations, you are a state. And so what is a state? Well, a state is an entity that recognizes no authority above it. This is why Massachusetts does not qualify as a state, right? Because Massachusetts is bound by the laws of the United States. In other words, even if all the legislators and the governor of Massachusetts agreed and passed the law, and all the citizens of Massachusetts agreed 100% and passed the law, it still would be void if it contradicted the U.S. Constitution. And so Massachusetts is not a state. However, if the U.S. Congress and president pass a law, then that law is the law within this territory. It doesn't have to be in accordance with United Nations law. There is no entity that's recognized above the United States or whatever country you happen to be in, right? Okay. Well, what types of powers do states generally exercise? All right. A different way of saying this is what makes a state sovereign? What makes a state as sovereign means the ultimate authority. What types of things does a state need to possess in order to be sovereign? And that's a word we'll be looking at more and unpacking as we go along in this course, this idea of sovereignty. Well, sovereignty consists of a few different things. Probably fundamentally is the ability to coerce within that particular territory. In other words, the United States claims a monopoly on violence within its borders. No other state and no other entity is lawfully allowed to police within the United States. In other words, coercion. Let me see if I can explain this in a different way. If I was at school and I saw a student doing something I didn't like, and I asked that student to stop, and they didn't. And I pulled out a stick and I hit that student in order to make them stop. this is all hypothetically, of course, I would be arrested for assault. However, if a policeman saw something going on that he didn't like, he asked that same student to stop, and then he struck the student with a stick. That would be an exercise of his lawful authority. Hypothetically, of course, again, were I at school and I wanted to question somebody, and and they didn't want to come, and I threw them into my car, that would be called kidnapping. However, if the police do it, it's called a lawful arrest, right? Now, I'm not coming down on, making a statement on whether, police, whatever. Not even talking about it. I'm just saying that this is the way it is, right? Only the government has the right to arrest and to punish and to execute people, right? Private citizens do not. This is a monopoly that the government claims. That's part of its sovereignty, is the ability to do this sort of thing to individuals within its borders. Now, I need not worry about Canada doing that to me while I'm in the United States or any other state, unless I go to that state, and then that government has those powers over me. Another power that the state claims is the ability to tax. States must have the ability to tax to finance itself. Again, I'll use a ridiculous example, but if I needed money and someone had money and I wanted it, but they didn't want to give it to me, and I forcefully took it, that's called robbery. However, if the government needs money and it takes it from you, it's called a tax, and it's legal. All right? So part of sovereignty is the ability to tax. A third most important aspect of sovereignty is the ability to make law. Lawmaking abilities. States claim the right to regulate the lives of individuals within its boundaries. Lastly, for a state to function, it also needs to have some sort of administration, people who work within the state, whether as policemen or tax collectors or as judges or whatever other functions that state needs. It needs to have administrators. Now, these were all functions that were previously held by private individuals under feudalism, right? The local lord had these powers. But in the early modern period, these powers are going to be exercised by the state itself, as they are today. Now, there are many different types of states nowadays. Some of them are democracies. Some of them are republics. Some are communists. Some are socialists. Some are whatever. But in the early modern period, the first states were monarchies, sometimes called absolutist monarchies. And in an absolutist monarchy, all of the powers of the state are invested in one person, the king. Perhaps the most classic expression of this was attributed to Louis XIV, the King of France in the early modern period. Louis is supposed to have once said, "I am the state." All right. Now, all governments have some sort of rationale for why it exists, a theory for why it exists, and why it has these powers, right? People often wonder, well, why do I have to listen to what the state says? Well, everyone has its rationale. In the early modern period, the rationale was that the king exercises his power by divine right. In other words, the king's power comes directly from God himself. People were much more religious in the early modern period. And almost everybody believed that if anybody was going to exercise any power, it must come directly from God. And so if kings were going to exercise this power, they needed to provide a theory for why they had it. And so you would need to somehow make people believe that God had given you this power. All right. And essentially the argument is, well, we have the state has these powers. God could have given this power to anybody, but he chose to give it to this particular king. Could have given it to you, he could have given it to I, but he gave it to this king. And so this king must be here because God wanted him to be there. And because God has appointed him there, he's answerable only to God. Not to nobles, not to the people, not to judges, not to anybody but God himself. Now, another aspect of absolutist monarchies, and monarchies in general, is as power was increasingly concentrated around the king, their courts tended to become more elaborate. Now, I'm not talking about a court of law, I'm talking about a royal court, where the king lives and where his nobles and those around him. The king's court was going to become the center of society as kings grew in stature. It was going to be a court where kings would dispense patronage, where they would dispense money and favors to the powerful people that surrounded them. Nobles would need to be mollified. Nobles would need to be soothed to some degree. These were powerful men still, and potentially dangerous men to the king. And they would need to be kept an eye on. And so courts were places where nobles would surround the king. You've probably heard the statement, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer, right? And so kings could keep a wary eye on their nobles at court. If they were out on their own estates far away, well, they could potentially get into mischief. And so kings made it so that nobles would have to live near them. The important ones anyways. And so court was a place where they could go and be near the king, and the king could keep his eye on them. He could reward them for his loyalty with patronage, with favors. Gratify their egos with the prestige of being so close to government. And also, importantly, keep them spending money. It was expensive to keep up with the Joneses at court, to keep up with the other nobles through elaborate parties and costumes. And this is the way kings liked to have it. Because if their nobles were spending money at court, it meant that they weren't spending money on rebellions or on nefarious political activities. They were engaging in conspicuous consumption. All right. Well, how did we get to a state where kings were so weak in the Middle Ages to the point where they're able to bring these powerful nobles to heel? Well, it was a long process, but the proximate cause were, again, the wars of religion. During these wars, and when things were so chaotic, both internationally and internally, when people were looking for someone to save them, kings used these emergencies to raise armies. ostensibly to protect the nation from religious sects and religious fanatics and outside invaders. But once the army had been raised, kings could also begin to use the army on troublesome nobles to intimidate them and to force them to gradually give up power to the king himself. And so the state began to claim that monopoly on violence, which nobles had also shared during the Middle Ages. They had had their own private armies, essentially. But through the use of the king's army, these nobles were gradually neutered of much of their power. And so the army of the early modern period was much different than earlier armies. For one, it wasn't going to be an army for only 40 days. It was going to be a standing army. Kings were going to have an army all the time, both to protect the country from invasion, but also to be ready in case there was a rebellion among the nobility. To be there always to demonstrate that the king was now effectively in control. And only kings were going to be able to have the resources to pay and to equip and to keep these armies loyal. Smaller entities like nobles and towns weren't going to be able to afford this sort of thing. And so warfare was going to become royalized. Furthermore, kings were going to be able to recruit armies directly from their population. They weren't going to need to go through intermediaries anymore. Nobles would be hired by the king directly. They wouldn't have their own private armies anymore, but would be part of the hierarchy. Usually members of the officer corps were drawn from the nobility. Usually the higher ranking you are as a noble, the higher up in the military chain you would be. The infantry, the grunts, the foot soldiers would increasingly be drawn either from the peasantry or from townsfolk, lower class people. And they would be recruited directly by the king himself. Now, critical to all of this was going to be money. Because by medieval standards, early modern government was astronomically expensive. Warfare to train and equip all these people was astronomically expensive by the standards of the day. The costs of having a court, a royal court, and the buildings necessary to house the nobility, and the money that the king was going to dispense to keep the nobility loyal, astronomically expensive. Paying administrators, people to run the government, astronomically expensive. And if kings were to keep this whole system running, they would need to have a reliable stream of income. And so traditionally, in the Middle Ages, kings had called assemblies of nobles, and they would have to be granted permission. Early modern kings are going to do no such thing. They will gradually do away with assemblies, and they will begin to directly tax their subjects without asking. Now, many nobles were resistant to this idea, and kings overcame this resistance in two ways. One is they made a deal with the nobility that they wouldn't tax the nobility. The nobility, as part of their, just for the sake of being noble, would be exempted from taxation. And so this eliminated a massive obstacle So nobles wouldn't be quite so reluctant if they weren't going to be taxed. It's going to create problems later down the line, because obviously this is a massive stream of revenue that the state was going to have to forego, but that's a different lecture. But in addition to mollifying the nobles by not collecting taxes from them, kings also had recourse to the army. Honestly, if anybody said anything, if anyone raised too much of a fuss, the king had a standing army and could suppress any revolts. Now, kings could tax in one of two ways. One was direct taxation. And direct taxation is essentially a tax that you physically pay. In other words, you get a bill for your taxes. So income tax is a type of direct taxation, right? You pay this tax and you pay it directly. All right. And in the early modern period, the most typical type of direct taxation was a tax on land. All right. And so a tax on land tended to hit the peasantry very hard because they had land. They rented land, and so they'd have to pay taxes on that land. And this is an additional tax. Not only did they have to pay their rent to their landlord, but a whole brand new bill to help support this increasingly large state. All right, and so it's going to be very hard on the peasants, direct taxation. And of course, nobles don't pay it. Another form that some kings had was indirect taxation. And indirect taxation is kind of like sales tax. And so various forms of commerce were taxed, various commodities, goods that were purchased. A tax was levied on them that went to the king. Or trade internationally, right? Customs duties went to the king. And so this was a really lucrative source of revenue. The more commerce, the more commercial activity you had in your kingdom, the better this was because, this was tax money. Now, obviously, some kings are going to have more of this type of tax than others. Kings with very robust merchant classes and with a lot of commerce going on, they would raise a lot of money through indirect taxation. Now, other places like in Eastern Europe, where there's very little commercial activity, kings there are going to be poorer because they're not going to have this stream of revenue. And so they'll have to rely almost exclusively on direct taxation. Another really important aspect of the state is the ability to make law, like I mentioned. In the Middle Ages, most law was local, whatever the particular lord of that manor deemed. And it was usually customary. It oftentimes wasn't even written down. It was just the custom of this particular territory. Increasingly, law is going to be written down, and increasingly, royal law is going to become important. Now, you may know if you've taken American history or if you've taken political science, or you just may know that oftentimes the state is broken into three different branches: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. So in the United States, the executive is the president. Congress is the legislative, the law-making branch. That's all that means. And the judicial is the Supreme Court. In an absolutist government, though, all these powers are held by one person, the king. Not only is he the executive, the person who runs government and directs the army, commander-in-chief, his word is also the law of the land. If the king wishes it, it's the law. And he's also the judge. I mean, his royal judges are the judges. They're not an independent branch. They do the bidding of the king. And so we saw that in the Middle Ages, there were these assemblies. If the king wanted a law, he would have to go and ask the nobility. But in the early modern period, the kings are going to do away with these assemblies. And they are going to become the sole source of law. This is part of that centralization process. And so the king in his law, there isn't going to be any intermediary between the king and his subjects. The king will directly legislate laws that his subjects are bound to follow. His judges will go out throughout the land and they will enforce his law. They will go out and hear cases and directly dispense justice to the king's subjects. All right, and so this puts an incredible amount of power in the hands of the state again. The power to regulate people's lives. As we said, states also need a form of administration. People to go out and do to administer things, a bureaucracy. And I just realized this slide has the wrong subheading. It shouldn't say early modern finance. It should say early modern bureaucracy. Pardon this era. Okay. So absolutist administration. Well, earlier we've seen the administration was local, right? The local lord was the judge. He was the administrator. He was the tax collector. He was everything, right? He was the government. The government was in his private hands. And so, if you were to look at it from the king's perspective, there's all these lords administering their own little territory, and they were a layer in between the king and his subjects, right? For as many different lords you had, you know, so this occurred. In the early modern period, though, government is going to become centralized. Through the king's different departments and ministries, the king was going to directly be able to administer justice to his population. He was going to directly be able to recruit into his army from the population. He was going to directly be able to tax the population through his various ministries and different departments. All right, so a pretty big change. Now I want to mention there's an important difference between the East and the West here. I'll go back to the previous slide for just a second. In the West, kings would often staff their bureaucracy with members of the middle class when they could. The reason for this is because kings are suspicious of the nobility. Remember, the nobles have just recently been shorn of their power. They're still powerful men, and kings are reluctant to put them in positions of power for fear that they might try to monopolize this power to themselves. And so kings would much rather use members of the middle class, members of the bourgeoisie. One, because they tend to be more educated and ambitious. And two, because they're non-noble and they don't have the same pretensions to power. They'll owe their position directly to the king and more likely than not be more reliable administrators. In Eastern Europe, kings don't have the luxury of using the middle class in government because there isn't a middle class worth speaking of. And so in Eastern Europe, kings are going to staff their bureaucracy with their nobility. Not that the nobility is going to have this, power like before. The king isn't going to consult them if he wants to make a law. He's not going to consult them to raise taxes. But they will be the ones who carry out the king's wishes. They'll have a much more active role in government than the nobles of the West, who will essentially just be there to hang around in court. The East, they're going to be known as a service nobility. They're going to have to work, in other words. I want to briefly look at several different countries that are going to become models of absolutism to some degree. And the greatest of all of the absolute monarchs was in France. France under Louis XIV. France, of course, was the most populous, the most prosperous of all European countries at this particular time, the most powerful. And under its great king, Louis XIV, French absolutism became the gold standard of absolutism, became the standard by which other monarchs judged themselves. They sought to emulate. Now, because France does have an active bourgeoisie and it does have a noble class, Louis is going to become a master at playing these two powerful groups off against each other. He's going to create the Palace of Versailles, just outside of Paris, as his personal home and also the seat of government. Here, Louis is going to build hundreds of apartments for his nobles so that they can live and he can keep an eye on them. Here, they will play at court. Louis will dispense patronage and favors and jobs to them. In a completely separate wing, he's going to employ his middle-class administrators and he's going, the active part in government will be there, completely separate from the nobles. And it's at Versailles that really is going to become the epicenter of French culture. It's still there, by the way. If you ever go to France, you can still see the opulent palace at Versailles. Another important absolutist nation is going to be the nation of Prussia. Now, most people have heard of France, but not many people have heard of Prussia, and that's because it doesn't really exist anymore. You can see Prussia on this map. It's located in purple, right in the central part of this map. Now, Prussia is going to emerge out of an entity called the Holy Roman Empire. Now, this is often a confusing term because the Holy Roman Empire doesn't really have anything to do with the old Roman Empire. On this map, you can see the outlines of it in red. And the Holy Roman Empire was an entity right in the center of Europe that was a kingdom of sorts in the Middle Ages, but really broke up during the wars of religion and spawned several powerful kingdoms and principalities. One of the most powerful was this Kingdom of Prussia that emerged out of it. Now, spoiler alert, Prussia is essentially going to be the foundation for modern Germany. And in Prussia, coming out of the wars of religion, the kings of Prussia were able to seize the initiative, use their powerful armies to subdue its nobility. In Prussia, the nobility were called Junkers. spelt with a J, by the way. The J is pronounced like a Y in German. And for Prussia, it's a little country. If you look at it compared to other countries, the army was especially critical here because it was vulnerable. It was surrounded by bigger and more powerful countries. And so Frederick the Great and other Prussian monarchs really prioritized the army. They recruited the Junkers into the military officer corps and recruited the serfs into the main part of the army. And Prussia, which was going to become Germany, started off in this very militaristic sort of way. Another thing about Prussia is Prussia was regarded as the most well-administered country. The Prussian kings took their bureaucracy very serious, and they were, they came close to eliminating corruption. The civilian bureaucracy was incredibly well run for the time. The Junkers were well trained. In order to be part of this administration, you had to pass exams, something that was unheard of at the time. And university training was really the norm. Administrators had to submit detailed reports through the chain of command, and so it was a really well-run country by the standards of the day, really the gold standard as far as that went. Another country to emerge out of the Holy Roman Empire was Austria. Austria had been the most important of all of the German, the territories within the Holy Roman Empire, and it became an important nation afterwards, coming out of the wars of religion. One of the unique features about Austria is that Austria was going to acquire some territories of its own that weren't really Austrian. They weren't German speaking. One of the areas that it was going to acquire, and you can see Austria here in the yellow color, was going to acquire a territory called Bohemia. Now, we don't call this area Bohemia anymore. We now call it the Czech Republic. And so they speak Czech. They don't speak German. They don't speak the language that Austria speaks. Another really important territory that Austria was going to acquire was going to be the Kingdom of Hungary. And you can see that on the map just to the east of Austria. And so the Austrians were going to be a pretty big, they were going to be a pretty big kingdom, a big empire, really. But one of the unique features about it, especially going forward, is that it's going to be very multinational. There's going to be many different languages that are spoken in this empire. Each of these kingdoms, Bohemia, Austria, and Hungary, all have their own traditions and their own languages that aren't related to each other. And so the emperor is going to be able to maintain his power by playing off different groups, but this is going to be increasingly hard as this course goes forward for reasons we'll see. So Austria, another one of these absolutist nations. Finally, the last territory that I want to look at, the last kingdom, absolutist kingdom, is Russia. Now, Russia was the most primitive of all of these. Its economy was very, very agricultural based, and it was really far away from the rest of Europe. You can see it here, that the darker green blotch, and you can see the rest of Europe there, but it's also huge. Russia was huge back then and was going to get way bigger. I mean, nowadays Russia is like something like 11 time zones or something. The US has like 3. So it's massive, monster country. And Russia during the early modern period is going to become absolutist under its great king, Peter the Great. And it's going to increasingly involve itself in European affairs. Now, the Russian Tsar, as the king is going to be called, which is just the Russian word for Caesar or emperor, by the way, is going to be pretty cash poor. It's going to be, like I said, largely agricultural. And so the Russian Tsar, in order to attract nobles into his service, is going to reward these nobles with titles and with land. All right, so part of the reward for serving either in the military or in the bureaucracy is land with serfs on them. And so serfdom is going to be particularly harsh in Russia. And the Tsar and his nobles are going to be very active in trying to keep serfs on the land. And this is because in order to support this monarchy, the serfs are going to be taxed very, very heavily. It's going to be very miserable to be a Russian serf. And so this temptation for many of these people is going to be to flee to avoid taxation. Obviously, the nobles don't want their serfs fleeing, and nor does the emperor. The Tsar doesn't want that either, because then he can't tax them. And so the Russian serf is going to be bound to the land, and like much of the rest of Eastern Europe, serfdom is going to be the norm there. The Tsar of Russia is going to be particularly reliant on his nobles, who are going to have to work in government, the service nobility that we mentioned. Okay, a bit of a long lecture, but an important one. So what I'd like you to do now is to answer this question in our discussion forum. How was early modern monarchy different from medieval monarchy?